Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Selling Greenville, your favorite real estate podcast here in lovely Greenville, South Carolina. I'm your host, as always, Stan McCune, realtor right here in Greenville, South Carolina. You can find all of my contact information in the show notes if you need to reach out to me for any of your real estate needs. And just a reminder, as always, this episode is sponsored by Piper Insurance Group, my go-to for home, auto, and umbrella insurance. They are an independent insurance agency, so they can quote you with multiple different companies to get you the best possible rate on your home, auto, or umbrella policy in South Carolina, North Carolina, or Georgia, including investment properties, flips, rentals, ground up new construction, commercial, etc. So please contact Piper Insurance Group. Their information is in the show notes alongside of my information, which is also in the show notes, as I've already said. And please, reminder, please like, rate, review, subscribe, all those good things to support this show and get it out to as many people as possible. Today, I want to go on a bit of a rant about an egregious appraisal story that I had. And I have had multiple of these in the 4.5 years I've been doing this show. I've had multiple great appraisal stories for y'all. And yeah, appraisers are a necessary part of this process, and a lot of appraisers in the Greenville market are really good. But unfortunately, there's a lot of bad apples as well. And sometimes the bad apples can really throw monkey wrenches into a transaction. And that's something that can be extremely, extremely frustrating when you're in the middle of it, when you're in the thick of it. By the way, if I sound, before I get too in the weeds here, if I sound different, I feel different. I have like a frog in my throat. I'm probably going to be coughing, swallowing hard, doing things like that throughout this. So please be patient with me. I'm trying to get you guys the weekly content that my weekly listeners so desire. So please bear with me as I'm getting it out. I basically canceled my day today, but not this podcast, because you guys deserve this podcast. And by the way, also, before I get too deep into the weeds here, I'm not talking about the elections in this podcast, because even though I'm going to be releasing this after Election Tuesday, I am recording this before Election Tuesday. So unfortunately, if you guys are hoping for election analysis, because some of you guys know that I'm big into politics and all that kind of stuff, that's not happening this episode. Maybe next week, maybe not. I don't know. We'll just have to play it by ear. Okay. So, appraisers, love-hate relationship with realtors. They need us. We need them. They might not think that they need us, but they do. And we don't necessarily think that we need them, but we do. We're all an important part of the process. But appraisers don't have a lot of accountability, right? They can essentially do whatever they want. I mean, I talked to you guys a few weeks ago about the crazy mobile home transaction situation I had. That thing still hasn't closed because of the appraiser that's involved with that and the insane requirements that are going above and beyond the HUD and FHA requirements for vinyl skirting and for the backing to the skirting. He's gone completely, in my opinion, completely rogue in terms of what he thinks needs to happen with regard to that foundation for that mobile home. But I digress. That is not the appraiser's problem, right? I'm not saying that the appraiser is at fault for that. The appraiser's got to do what they think is the right thing based on the guidelines that they know are there. My issue with appraisers is that they don't have a ton of accountability. And here's the thing, okay? Here's the actual meat and potatoes of what I'm trying to get to here. I personally have a property with a loan coming due on it. And even though rates right now are high, I have some investment opportunities that I really want to take advantage of, and I've been wanting to take advantage of. But I've just kind of been on the fence with, okay, how much money do I utilize for these different investments? How much do I need to factor in that I need kind of an emergency fund because it's probably going to be a lean next few months of real estate, et cetera, et cetera. And so as I was really thinking about this, I have this property that already has a note coming due within the next few months. Technically, I could have waited until kind of a year from now before refinancing it. But are rates going to come down that dramatically a year from now? It's really hard to say. Projections are that they will, but I'm not sure. I think that this is where the election really does matter. But regardless, I decide, you know what? I'm going to have to do this refinance the next year anyway. I've got all these investment opportunities. What I can do is I can do a cash out refinance on the property, and then I can take that money and then reinvest it and hopefully make more than what my interest is on the loan. Now, before I get into the details of that specific story, I do want to discuss the cash out refinance angle for just a second. So let's start basic, okay? A cash out refinance is like a normal refinance, except the bank pays you at closing an amount equal to somewhere between 75 to 80% typically of the value of the property. Sometimes in certain situations, you might be able to get higher than that, but it's pretty rare. It's typically 75 to 80% of the value. That's the amount of cash that the bank pays you at closing. And if you had any debt on the property prior to your refinance, that debt is typically required to be paid off as well as part of the cash out refi. Now, why would I want to do a cash out refinance as opposed to simply selling the property, right? If I'm wanting to get cash out of the property, right? Because selling the property would get me 100% of the equity rather than these 75 to 80%, right? If we're talking about a property that's worth $500,000, if you're selling it, you just get $500,000 worth. Whereas if you're doing a cash out refi, you get 75 to 80% of $500,000. So why would I go the refinance route rather than just selling the property? Well, for starters, I want to keep the property, right? It's been doing well for me. I like the property. I like where it is. It's pretty low maintenance. I'm not ready to sell it. The rent it brings in will pay off any loans I have on it. Has been doing that for years. In fact, for the cash out refinance loan, that's a requirement. It needs to be able to service itself, at least for this specific loan product that I'm getting. And at the end of the day, if the appraisals came back insanely high and the income from the properties couldn't pay off the debt, then I wouldn't be able to get to do the full 75 to 80%, right? It's got to be able, whatever, even if, let's just say I got an outlier appraisal that was worth, that said the property was worth way more than it really was, or let's say that it wasn't cash flowing as well as it should be, that can also impact what sort of, how much of a loan that I'm able to take out on these properties. But regardless, that's kind of an aside. But the main thing is, like I said, I want to keep the property. I don't want to sell it. So I want to keep it. I just want to take advantage of the equity that I have, right? And by the way, this is a big talking point right now, not in real estate, but in other parts of investing and markets, is the idea of taxing people on unrealized gains in their property, right? And this is partially why I'm against that. Now they said that Vice President Harris and others have said that they don't want to do that on people like myself, normies. They only want to do it on super wealthy people, but ultimately taxes typically that are imposed on wealthy people do usually come down to us normies. And I don't want to be taxed on my unrealized gains on properties like this. This is exactly what you need to be able to do in order to take advantage of the tax structure. Because if you're not, you're just taxed out of oblivion, basically, is what the government tries to do for those that aren't savvy. They really try to take advantage of the people that don't have accountants, that don't have tax professionals, that don't know what they're doing. And that's why people hate wealthy people so much, and why people keep wanting to tax wealthy people more and more, because wealthy people have all these resources at their disposal to basically game the tax structure. Well, we all have those resources available to us in one way or another. It's just a matter of finding the right people around you that know how to take advantage of the tax code for you specifically. And that leads right into kind of the next part of this that makes this strategy a slam dunk, is that when you do a cash out refinance, the money you receive from it is debt, not income, at least currently, right? As I'm recording this in November of 2024, if this changes in the future, don't hold me to it. But currently, when you do a cash out refinance, it's considered that you're not receiving income, you're actually receiving debt. Yes, you have a bunch of money now in your bank account, but it is not taxable like income is, okay? On the flip side, if you sell a property like this, a rental property, and then, you know, basically have to report that to the IRS, which you do, and to the Department of Revenue in South Carolina. You then have to pay capital gains, which for a property like this could be around 25% of the sales price between both state and federal capital gains. Well, nobody wants to pay taxes. And obviously, there are times when it makes sense to sell a property and pay capital gains. I've done it many times. But if you want to keep the property like I do, that's obviously not a route that you want to go in. And I should mention as well, just in case people are confused or just want me to clarify, that you can sell a property and defer your capital gains by then immediately doing what's called a 1031 exchange and purchasing another property. But that doesn't get you your money, it just gets you another property. So that only makes sense if you're just wanting to get rid of a property for some reason, but you don't want to pay capital gains. You also don't need the cash on hand. You just want to replace it with another property. That's really the only way, and for me, that makes sense. In this case, I want to keep the property and I want the cash. Okay, so the cash out refinance was the best route. Okay, so back to the story at hand. The property I'm refinancing is a unique property. Specifically, it's 2 duplexes on 2 separate parcels, but the parcels are adjacent to each other on a corner. The 2 duplexes, so 4 units total, 2 duplexes, 2 structures, they share a parking lot between them, right? So even though they're 2 separate parcels, they butt up against each other and they share a parking lot. It's actually, they're actually on a corner. So they're actually on 2 separate streets, but because it's a corner, they're right next to each other. And each duplex is identical. They look exactly the same. When I bought them back in 2020, I did a full remodel on them, interior remodel, exterior remodel, new siding, new roofs, all of that, new windows, everything. Even got in trouble with the county because I tried to do the roof without permitting, which was an honest mistake. I thought that the roofer had pulled permits, so that was like a whole thing. But even since then, even since 2020, I've done additional work to them as well. As tenants have come in and out, we've updated even more things since then. Now, after pricing out with a few lenders, what the terms were and different things with regard to the cash out refinance, I went with one and we moved forward with ordering appraisals. The way they had to do this was they had to do appraisals on each property. So 2 separate appraisals, and they had to be done by different appraisers, okay? With the end result being basically 2 separate loans, 1 for each duplex. So the first appraisal came in. In my head, I was ballparking for them. This was a part of my initial discussion with my loan officer. I was ballparking for them to come in maybe in the 215 to 225,000 range for each duplex, right? These are small duplexes, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom per unit, and it's in a transitional area. So the land value isn't that great. And so they're not we're not talking about like $500,000 duplexes. We're talking about, low to mid 200s. But obviously I wanted to get the highest possible cash out, right? That's the whole idea. When you're doing a cash out, you want the cash, right? It's only, for every $10,000 that you're bringing out of your cash out, it's not that much more added to the monthly cost of the loan. So I wanted to get the most cash out. But I'm realistic, right? I'm not the type of person that I'm going to go to my loan officer and be like, oh yeah, these are worth 300,000 each, when there's just no way that they're worth 300,000 each. So I thought those numbers, 215 to 225 per duplex, were realistic. So total between the 2 of them, 430 to 450. I thought those values made sense, especially given that appraisers tend to be conservative on values when someone is doing a cash out. So I also wanted to make sure that I was conservative. And I say that's conservative because it's hard to get a duplex in the low 200s right now, right? If those were out there and just readily accessible, I have a lot of clients that would be buying them up, but there's just not a whole lot of that out in the market right now. Okay, so what happened? Well, I got the first appraisal in, and it came back at $275,000. I was elated. I mean, I could not believe it. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect it to come back that high. I couldn't even sell it for that much on the open market. I mean, let's just be real. But remember that appraisals don't tell you what a property is worth in the current market. They assign a value based on what the market has been basically for the past year, loosely speaking, in that general area. So sometimes appraisals are just all about timing, right? You can get lucky or unlucky on an appraisal based on what has just sold in the past few months or what hasn't sold in the past few months. Even though appraisers are technically supposed to account for that, okay? But there's definitely a luck element involved. Well, in this case, I was fortunate that we had some good comps that the appraiser was willing to use. And actually, that was one of the reasons why I came up with that 215 to 225 value, is that there was a very, very recent comp back in October that sold for 218. And so I really felt like I was enraged. 275 blew me away. Couldn't believe it. But then the second appraisal came in. Now remember, these are two identical properties right next to each other, and they're both bringing in the same cash flow. Now, I knew the second one wasn't going to be as high as the first one. I mean, that first one, that was like a once-in-a-lifetime high appraisal, right? But what I got for the second appraisal still stunned me. The second one came in at $195,000, an $80,000 difference. Excuse me. An $80,000 difference between two identical properties right next to each other. Now, I can understand, sometimes that could happen. Let's say that we're talking about like two $2 million properties. You might see two appraisals on two $2 million properties that are identical come in $80,000 apart. That would be normal because 80,000 is a smaller percentage of 2 million than it is of 200,000, right? So for there to be an $80,000 difference for two identical properties that are priced in the 200s, even though that one came in at 195, should have been in the 200s, that you just don't see that. I mean, that was like, again, that was like a once in a lifetime kind of experience for me as a realtor. I've never seen anything like that, and I hope that I never see anything like that again. So I talked to my loan officer about it. And he reminded me that even though the one appraisal was lower than expected, the other one was so much higher than expected that I was still basically in range with what I was hoping to pull out cash-wise between the two properties, right? Because I was looking for, the total value for the two properties to come into the 430 to 450 range. And here we were between those two appraisals coming in at what, 490? Am I doing that math? No. 470. Hold on. I can never do math while I'm trying to do a podcast. Yeah, 470. You'd be surprised how your brain just shuts off when you're trying to create content like this. It's how people on the news media, if it can sometimes freeze up there on stage. I completely empathize with them because I experience that when I do this podcast sometimes. So I was at 470. So that's still exceeding what I originally came in expecting, but I'm not trying to be greedy, but I'm in this for maximum cash out. And I saw the opportunity to get more money by trying to get that low appraisal to be higher. And I am calling it a low appraisal. If you're an appraiser listening to this, that was a low appraisal. In no world is that property worth $195,000. I'm sorry. Now there was another really dumb aspect to all of this, unrelated to the appraiser and the appraisal, but impacted by the appraiser and the appraisal. So I had told you before that typically for a cash out refinance, you're getting 75 to 80% loan to value, LTV. And in this case, because these were rentals, I couldn't do 80%. I couldn't find a lender. I'm sure if I had really, really worked hard, I probably could have found a lender to do 80% LTV. But I really like to stick with my group of lenders that I know are going to get the job done. And so I didn't want to just start, internet researching, trying to find this random one-off lender that would probably screw me in the end. I wanted to stick with my group, right? And within my group, the lenders that I really trusted for something like this could only do 75% LTV without the rate being astronomical. I could have gone to 80, but the rate would have gone way up. But when the second appraisal came in at 195,000, that actually pushed me into a worse mortgage rate because ironically, the loan had to be $150,000 or less in order to get the rate that I had originally been quoted. And so being under $200,000 And at 75% LTV, that meant that my loan was going to be less than $150,000, which meant that I was also, in addition to not pulling out the cash that I wanted, that I was hoping for that property, I'm also in a higher mortgage rate bracket than I would have been if he had just appraised it at $200,000 versus $195,000. Or I had to then drop down to 70% LTV to get the rate to be lower. So all of this really, really annoyed me. It's really dumb. Bad appraisal. Like, everyone knows that this is a bad appraisal except the appraiser that wrote it. So talked to the loan officer, and we decided to submit a rebuttal on the low appraisal. And so how I started this was I started by looking at the higher appraisal and comparing that to the lower ones and just saying, okay, what are the differences between the two? And there are multiple things that stood out right away. First off, the lower appraisal had 4 sold comps and 2 unsold comps. Now, why would there be unsold comps in here? Well, what I've been told, and I don't understand why appraisers do this personally, but the unsold comps, so these are properties that are on the market. One is under contract, one's not. The unsold comps are essentially used to justify the value. But the unsold comps were the highest, were much higher than what my appraisal came in at. So that didn't even make sense. But the higher appraisal had the same 4 sold comps, but it had 2 other sold ones as well that were much higher, and that really impacted that value coming in at 275. And here's the thing that really annoyed me when I started digging into this. One of the most expensive sold comp that the higher appraisal had in it that the lower one didn't was literally next door to one of the unsold comps that the lower appraisal had in it to justify the value. So long story short, the appraiser for the lower appraisal used an unsold comp that was right next to a sold comp, and he didn't use the sold comp. That doesn't make any sense, right? Because you're looking for sold comps. You're not looking for unsold comps. Unsold comps don't tell you anything, right? And he of course, made adjustments to the unsold comps, assuming, that they're going to sell for much less than what they were on the market for. So all of this hurt me, and it didn't make any sense. You had a sold comp right there. Use it. If you can use the unsold comp to justify the other comps that you used, for sure, you can use the sold one. And yes, it fit everything. The other appraiser had used it. There was no reason to not use it. By the way, the higher appraiser in this story is known to be difficult to work with by many people in the industry. I'm not going to name names here. I don't like to do that. But this whole thing, as you could tell, I was really, really ticked off about it. And in my opinion, the lower appraisal didn't make appropriate adjustments, right? They're supposed to make adjustments based on value or not based on value, based on condition and based on other things. So, for instance, if an appraiser is having difficulty finding 1-bedroom duplexes, they might pull in some 2-bedroom duplex comps, and then make an adjustment and say, okay, well, being 2 bedrooms versus 1, that would make it $50,000 more valuable. So I'm going to make an adjustment and reduce the value of that for the purposes of this comparable analysis by $50,000. That's the sort of stuff that appraisers do. And in my opinion, the adjustments that the appraiser did for the lower appraisal, basically none of those adjustments were in my favor or in favor of the property, despite my property being on par with or nicer than the comps that he used. So it just didn't make sense. Now, unfortunately, these are really hard arguments to make with appraisers, right? They don't argue based on adjustments. I've never won an argument based on saying just in a vacuum that these adjustments are bad. You have to get uber or ultra. I tried to say uber and ultra at the same time. You got to be ultra and uber specific when you're rebutting and challenging an appraisal. As I mentioned before, the 2 comps that the other appraiser had used were much higher in terms of value, but they weren't particularly close to my property. Now, again, I already said that one of those 2 was right next to one of the unsold comps that the lower appraisal used. So I guess he wasn't concerned specifically about the distance. But again, I was concerned that if I just rebutted it with those two comps and making a few comments on the adjustments, I didn't think that that was going to be enough, and neither did my loan officer. He thought we needed more. He was like, 70% of the time these rebuttals don't work. We really need to dig a little bit more. So I started digging more closely. First, I started to try to find more comps that maybe they missed, and I just struck out. Now, I wasn't just looking in the multiple listing service. I was looking at public records. I was looking at all sorts of things. And, the market's been slow. There's not a whole lot of comps, particularly for duplexes, not a ton of them that sell in any given year. And so I just struck out. So then I decided to dig into the comps that the appraiser did use. And I specifically wanted to focus on the two comps that seemed to really drag down the value that he assigned to my property the most. So I start to look specifically at, I took the first one and I'm like, all right, let me look at this and let me compare it to my property and let's just see what I come up with, right? Excuse me. Whew. Throat's starting to get rough here. All right, gutting it out for you guys. Hope you appreciate it. So I pulled up the first comp in the multiple listing service, and nothing really jumped out too crazy to me. But as I'm looking at it, I'm looking at where it is on the map, just trying to account for, okay, what's its location? I noticed on the map that there was a little blue line behind the duplex. Well, that's interesting, I thought. That usually means that there's a creek there, right? That's normally in this mapping software that's tied into the multiple listing service, which might actually be Google Maps. I can't remember exactly, but basically that little blue line typically means a creek. And where there's a creek, there is usually a floodplain. So I pulled up a flood map for that comp, and it shined 100% blue. Floodplain everywhere. Every inch of that property was in a floodplain. And let me tell you, if you're from out of South Carolina and you're in an area like maybe coastal Florida or wherever, maybe even coastal Carolina area, you might not realize this, but in Greenville, being in a floodplain, and this has been the case for forever. This has nothing to do with Helene, in case you're wondering. Being in a floodplain really, really hurts your property value in Greenville. People don't want to be in a floodplain. They want nothing to do with it. And it hurts the value of any property. But you know what? Even though my duplexes weren't in floodplains, the appraiser didn't make any adjustments to value based on this lower comp being in a floodplain. So obviously, I'm super excited when I see this. I'm like, this is a very simple, easy argument to make to the appraiser that the land value of these properties is not comparable. There should be a big difference. Really, at this point, I really just want him to get him over 200,000. So at the very least, I can get that better mortgage rate that I wanted. All right, good. So simple argument to make. Simple typically helps. Now let's look at the next low comp. Let's see what this one has. So I pulled up the next one. And even though it was on a different street, it wasn't a street I was familiar with. It was on a different street, but it was actually just a few doors down from the comp that I had just looked at that was in a floodplain. And guess what I saw? That beautiful same blue line going right across the back of the property behind that comp that I had seen with the other one that was in the floodplain. So I pulled up the flood map for that one, and sure enough, it shined blue like the ocean. The most beautiful blue that I have ever seen in my life. I was so pumped. The only two low comps that he had to justify an appraised value below 200,000 were both in floodplains. So out of the 4 comps that the appraiser used that were actually sold, 2 of them were in floodplains, and he made no adjustments on the basis of them being in the floodplain. So I sent all this info to the loan officer, and he submitted the rebuttal. And wouldn't you know it, within a few days, I had a new appraisal in my inbox for $220,000. Now, that's still a ridiculous $55,000 lower than the other appraisal. But that other appraisal, that's like I said, I just wasn't going to get a duplicate of that. I wish I could have had that appraiser do both properties. But that's fine. I've got no problem with that, right? Because now instead of me basing my 75% loan to value off of two properties worth 215 to 225,000 like I originally went into this process expecting, now I'm able to base it off of 75% of 247,500 each, right? Because if you add those values together, divide by two, the 220 plus the 275, you get almost 500,000. And then between the two of them, each of them will be functionally 247.5, even though that's for the purposes of the loan, that's not how it works. But for the purposes of my brain, that's how my brain works. So that's obviously a massive difference. And it put me in the best possible mortgage rate bracket for both of those properties at that 75% LTV number. And here's the crazy part. Based on all these numbers, I figured out that if I sold these properties based on how I believe the market is right now and then paid those capital gains taxes, I would basically have the same cash in hand as I received doing this cash out refinance. But the only difference is that I won't have to pay any taxes on the debt that I'm taking out, and I get to keep this property. I don't have to sell it. I get to keep it. It's going to keep going up in value. The rents are going to keep going up. It's a beautiful thing, and I get to take advantage of the equity now and then reinvest that and hopefully make good financial decisions that result in that money working for me in more ways. So I've got the property already working for me. Now the property is producing additional money that now I can reinvest and do other things, hopefully exciting things with that. So long story short, appraisers are frustrating and they need more accountability, but every great once in a while, an observant realtor can help an unobservant appraiser do their job better. And that is what happened this past week. So thank you guys for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions. My contact info in the show notes. Need a realtor in this area or just want to talk shop? Happy to do that. Please reach out. Please reach out to Piper Insurance Group as well for your home, auto, and umbrella insurance needs. Please like, rate, review, subscribe to the show. We will talk again next time.